Morning. Welcome to my allotment. The key word is sustainability. With vegetable gardening, it's a bit different from ornamental gardening because you're growing annual stuff and there's a fast turnover. So digging is a simple way of making that an easy thing to do. And you can, if you do dig and you put fertiliser on and you use chemicals and all the rest of it, you, in all probability, will get a better crop. But you won't get a better crop forever. And farming is, the agricultural industry is discovering that if you use machinery and you put a lot of pressure on the soil, you can't keep it up. The organic matter level starts to go down and the soil ends up completely racked out and useless. And there's an awful lot of soil around the world that has been rendered completely useless, unable to grow crops on by over-intensive agriculture. And if there's one thing that nature is very, very good at, it's sustainability. You look at environments like the prairies or whatever, and they were deep in grass and supporting huge herds of bison, millions of bison, for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years, with no cultivation, no fertiliser, no nothing at all. And surely we've got to be able to learn something from that. So you're not copying nature, but you are, looking at it with a fair amount of admiration, really, and informing what you do based on what nature does. And that's what I'm trying to do with this, is the ground around the wild areas around are covered in plants the whole time. Plants are key. Everybody focuses on the animal side of things, but the plants are what harvests the energy, and the energy is what drives the whole system. And basically, the more plants you've got for the longer period, the more of that energy you've got feeding into the system. And that's it's a soil stuff is immensely complicated to the point that it is virtually incomprehensible. And if it's virtually incomprehensible, it's easier to just back off and keep it very, very simple. Sort of paradox. That the best thing you can do is keep it very simple and just do what nature does, more or less, just a rough copy, and it works. I had this plot here for 9 years, I think now. I've changed the way that I do things quite a lot in that time. When I first got it, it was 1 year on from having been just a grassy meadow, but then had been allowed to grow back up again. So that first year I dug the whole thing from one end to the other and buried all the weed that was in the ground. After a couple of years I took up the idea of no-dig gardening, and I've been doing that. I haven't dug the plot since then. It saves me a lot of work, and frankly I can't see a good reason for digging, because it works just as well without digging as it does with digging. So what's the advantage? But if you look at it now, I will guess that you would think this is a bit of a mess. I suppose in a way you'd be right, but where the visuals are important in the ornamental garden, on the allotment the visuals are not really important. It doesn't need to be tidy looking. The basic layout here, I've got beds 4 foot wide, and then I've got paths which I've covered with metre wide Mypex folded into 3, pinned down with a loop of wire, and I go on the path. I walk on the paths, and I never ever step on the beds. I keep off the soil altogether. So it is actually pretty organised underneath the apparent surface mess. And come the spring, when I tidy it up a bit and get new crops growing, the structure of it will become more evident. It'll be easier to see what's going on. Having done no-dig, which is I suppose a bit like organic or permaculture or whatever, it's a kind of gardening philosophy, growing method. You grow your crops through your growing season, and then in the autumn, once you've cleared most of your crops away, you cover the ground with compost, a layer of compost, which protects the soil during the winter and provides organic matter which gets carried down into the soil by the worms and whatever. I had a couple of compost heaps and everything went on the compost heaps, and I did it by the book, but it was, to all intents and purposes, impossible to generate enough compost to cover all the beds in the autumn. So I started thinking about alternative ways of having organic matter. I was sowing Italian rye or Phacelia or whatever as a cover crop. I then started to pick up on the ideas that are around regenerative agriculture. And well, on a garden scale, this idea of covering the ground with compost in the autumn is practical. On a farm scale, it isn't. You simply cannot put a 2-inch layer of organic matter over the whole of a farm field in the autumn. It's just, you haven't got the volume, or it would cost you too much if you were buying it in from somewhere. So regenerative agriculture is using cover crops instead of the organic matter. A lot of the organic matter in the soil comes from the plant roots themselves. So both the roots breaking down in the soil and exudates that the plant roots produce account for a large chunk of the organic matter that gets into the soil. So suddenly these cover crops became not just a way of sort of covering the soil and protecting it in the winter, but also a way of maintaining the organic matter. So one of the principles, as it were, of regenerative agriculture is that you keep growing plants in the ground all the time, or for as much of the time as you possibly can. And I suppose after doing it for quite a while, I started to think of it as not exactly emulating nature, but informed by close observation of what nature does. And when you look around here, there's a grass meadow behind you. It doesn't go bare in the winter. The grass doesn't stop growing. It grows slowly, but it grows all winter through. So in a natural, as it does in the hedgerows and the sort of waste ground and the railway embankment, stuff is growing all year round. So the soil fauna, the microorganisms in the soil, are expecting that growing plant material to be there. If it's not there, if you take it all away from the time you harvest your potatoes in July to the time you plant your carrots or whatever in the following April, what are they living off? Their numbers have got to diminish. They probably would anyway over winter, but their numbers have got to diminish. So it's become a thing, an aim, an intention to try and keep growing stuff in the ground all year, for as much of the time as I possibly can. What I've got here growing, I've got leeks growing here. A bit further up I've got some perennial onions. There are peas that I planted out in the autumn. There's a row of parsnips there, 3 rows of carrots. The rabbits are now getting in and eating. Right, while I'm here, I'm going to just harvest 1 or 2 things. I've got this celeriac here. I'll pull one of those up for my tea. One of the things with the no-dig method of bringing in a couple of inches of compost every year is that you're bringing in quite a lot of feed. And for no-dig gardeners to be boasting that they're not applying fertiliser to the ground, merely applying compost, is a bit, I think the word is disingenuous. There's a lot of nutrients in that compost. It may not be very concentrated, not like a fertiliser, but there's a lot of it. So they're putting quite a lot of fertiliser onto the soil in one shape, in the form of compost. And with the sort of freshly shredded stuff, there is a lot less nutritional matter in there. And I do occasionally put a little bit of fertiliser on, just to supplement it. We're also in Cornwall with a fairly high rainfall, so that tends to sort of leach out the very soluble nitrogen. And I haven't had much luck with growing nitrogen fixing cover crop plants. So I'm not able to, I haven't yet found a method for replacing the lost nitrate. More perennial onions up the way there. I did have chard, but that seems to have been killed off by the frost. Beetroot was keeping me going into the autumn. So there's quite a lot of the ground is taken up by growing crops, a lot of which are deciduous, and the tops of, the carrots have died. The tops have died right away. And then in the spaces, in the areas that were bare ground, I've got on this plot here. I did them as plugs because I was rather late on doing it, because I had a crop of onions in there till quite late on, just to get ahead of myself a bit. And I put in between what was left of the onions, I planted Italian ryegrass and a plant called Phacelia. Phacelia has been very successful for me in that it produces a lot of dense coverage, but it not frost hardy. The Italian rye is great, but when it comes to the spring and you're trying to clear the ground in order to plant new crops without digging, if you were digging it in wouldn't be a problem, but without digging, it's quite difficult to get rid of. And I take a sharpened spade and just slice the tops of it, so that I disturb the ground as little as possible. This is foxglove. These are foxgloves here. This is verbascum. Yellow flowers, grows up 4 or 5 feet. They're biennials, so they're germinating in spring and growing small plants. And then by this, through the winter, it's a big leafy crown of vegetation. One assumes that there's as much root underground as there is on the top. It's protecting the ground exceptionally well. It's producing a lot of vegetation, a lot of biomass. It's not flowering, so it's not a sort of weed in the sense that it's seeding everywhere. And come the spring, it's an awful lot easier to just slice that off with a sharpened spade or me hori than it is to get rid of the ryegrass. So I'm starting to think now in terms of, perhaps some of our own native plants as my cover crop. So what I'm probably going to do is to put aside a little area and just let foxgloves grow there, and then come when the potatoes are gone or the early peas are gone, I'll dig them up and plant them out in the area where the early crops have been, to go through the second half of the summer and into the winter, and stand right through the winter looking like that. And then come the spring, slice them off, stick them through my shredder, put the stuff that I shred back on the ground. Just spotted a couple of dandelions here, and I mean there's weeds and there's weeds, and some weeds are worse than others, but I guess for most people, from a gardener's point of view, dandelions are not one of their favourites. Dandelions are good from the point of view that they have deep roots, so they're bringing up nutrients from a long way down. They're spreading out flat, so they're protecting the soil surface very effectively. So they're a good cover crop type plant, and it's pretty easy to just slice the top off, and all right, the roots are in the ground. So in a month's time, I'll come along and I'll slice the top off again. You do that 4 or 5 times in the year, and they die off. So they're not a problem. I have worse problems than dandelions. Now, this apple tree here is a variety called Holstein, very good apple. But like most apples, it's not self-fertile, so it needs pollinators. And I've got another apple tree over the way there, which is got several varieties on it. And this one I want also to graft a different variety onto it, partly for pollination and partly because I've got another variety on another tree which I want to get rid of. So I'm going to transfer a bit of material across to this one. This is a young tree and I've been building up the crown on it for 3, 4, 5 years maybe now, with the intention eventually of spur pruning it, summer pruning it and keeping it at much the same sort of size. So this will be the last year that I winter prune it. And all I'm going to do is to cut these shoots back to 6 inches or so. Right, apple grafting, or grafting in general, is a bit of a sort of muck and magic area of gardening, but it's not especially difficult in principle. Two key things. That is, one is that you get a very, very good match between the tissues you're trying to graft. You don't want any air spaces between them. And the other is that once you've made the graft, that you keep it dry. So you would be working with 1-year-old shoots. So that's this year's, or the growth that it made in 2022, and about this time of year, middle of winter. So you've got to make that cut in one go, so you get a nice smooth finish. And you're aiming to make a diagonal cut of a length of about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. Depends a little bit on how thick the stem is. Ordinarily, you'd be grafting onto something of a similar thickness, so you'd make the same cut on the rootstock variety. So you've got, that's your scion, that's your rootstock, reasonably similar. Match them together. Now, if the stems are slightly different in thickness, you've got to match it so that the bit just below the bark is matched up on at least one side. Ideally all the way around, but at least on one side. The bit that's got to be matched is the cambium layer. That's the bit where the cells are dividing just below the bark. That has to match. That's the bit that's going to knit together. So that needs to be matched along one side at least. They are remarkably forgiving. If you don't get an absolutely perfect match, it's remarkable how they'll still take. So that's well matched along one side. And that then needs tying. And that can be done with proper rubber ties, which are like elastic bands, or it can be done with a bit of polythene strip. If you just cut 1/2 inch wide polythene of a polythene bag and tie it working from the top down, so that it's wrong way around, bottom up, so that it's overlapping, the layers of the wraps are overlapping like tiles, and it sheds water, and then pull it tight enough at the top so that water doesn't get in the top. It'll almost certainly succeed. You can use adhesive insulating tape, do the same thing, and that's it. It's as simple as that. Now you don't need that length. So the scion, I would cut, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 buds there, about that sort of length. Now, in practice, where I've cut these shoots off the tree, at the bottom they're pretty thick, a lot thicker than the stuff that I'm wanting to graft onto it. Now there, I'm never going to get a match the same. So what I'm going to do on this is to do it slightly differently, and this will be done on the tree, but I take, imagine that's the shoot still on the tree, and I'm going to take a piece off one side of that to match my scion into. Now again, I've gone too big, but the bark on this is thicker, so you can see the bark is quite a bit thicker, so the cambium layer is a bit further in, so it may not be too bad a match at all. So I then match that to that, and again tie that tightly. And that's what I'm going to be doing on the tree here. That's it. Another month, it's January, there's not a lot happening. It's been quite a cold winter, so the garden is looking relatively dull. I like to think that, you know, with grasses and the camellias around the place, that there's still something happening, but I have to admit it's a quiet season, shall we say. Anyhow, it's been nice having you here. Hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you next month.